Previously on BushWar.
Ons spesifieke taak was om die olietanks aan te val of die myne te plant daarop.
En dan my teiken met my 4 mense was die 2 distilleertorings, die hoofteikens gewees.
Ek en Kloppies het ons myne geplant, die eerste tanks, en ons het wegbeweeg na ons tweede teiken. Terwyl ons die tweede stel myne geplant het, het die eerstes ontplof.
Suid-Afrika kon nooit daai operasies herken nie. So al die operasies wat spesiale magte gedoen het en van die ander eenhede ook is toegeskryf aan Savimbi en Savimbi het ook die krediet daarvoor gevat.
Operation Candlelight in 1983, when 16 Special Forces operators almost destroyed an oil refinery in Luanda, was only one of many such operations in the course of the border war. It was always top secret, but when it became known, it was ascribed to Jonas Savimbi and UNITA.
You choose your friend, but you don't choose your enemy. The enemy comes on your way, and he imposes himself upon you. Unless you are strong enough and you gather all your courage and you face the enemy with whatever means at your command.
Soon after Candlelight, in February 1984, the Lusaka Agreement was signed. It stipulated that South Africa would withdraw all its troops from Angola. A buffer zone was declared north of the border, where no South African, Cuban or SWAPO forces were permitted. A joint monitoring commission had to police it. The agreement was breached constantly by all sides, however, and never really had an impact. The SADF continued planning operations in Angola, albeit under even stricter conditions of secrecy. In May 1985, Captain Wynand de Tooy formed part of one of these operations. The target, the oil depot at Cabinda in northern Angola.
The idea was to find something that would hurt as much as possible Angola's economy, something feasible, and could be a covert operation, and therefore one could say it's UNITA, etc., etc.
Successful sabotage would mean that Angola would lose an estimated $30 million in oil that was helping the government pay for the war.
Die doel van die operasie was om die olieopslagtank op te blaas, want op daai stadium was Cabinda Gulf verantwoordelik vir 73% van die Angolese regering se inkomste. So blaas ons daai tanke, kan die oorlog eintlik fisies tot stilstand kom.
There is no question that the selection of Cabinda, if you want to deal a heavy blow to the Angolan economy, it's a very good suggestion. It's a very good idea.
One complication was that the American company Gulf Oil had interests in the target at Cabinda. While most members of the international community boycotted and shunned South Africa at that stage, the USA, under President Ronald Reagan, implemented a policy of constructive engagement, which neutralized the international isolation to a great extent.
Now you are attacking an American company, and given where the explosion would have taken place, it was very close to where the American personnel working in Cabinda lived. So probably quite a few Americans would have died. And you can argue that that's not a very loyal thing to do to what is essentially one of the few allies you have left in the world.
Even so, the attack went ahead.
Op 21 Mei, daai oggend die son opkom, toe lê ons opleeplek in die middel van 3 Fapla Company basisse. Toe ons basies tussen hulle deur en soos hulle veiligheidspatrollies in die oggend gedoen het, het hulle op ons inkomspore afgekom, nat douspoor. Ons kon nie ons operasie in 1 nag doen nie. Toe moes ons oorbly vir die volgende nag en dis daar waar die groot probleem gekom het, want dis daai oplê en ons hou nie daarvan om op te lê nie, want dit maak jou baie kwesbaar. Ons het die patrollies die hele dag in die omgewing gesien en hulle basies ons heeltemal omsingel en so 4:15 in die middag toe vee hulle die bos En toe het ons kontak geslaan.
Hulle was 9 groepies van 3 elk verdeel. 2 van die 3-manskapgroepe het onttrek en teruggevlug met 'n bootjie op 'n skip, maar BushWarV2D2E2 se groep is 2 doodgeskiet en hy is swaar gewond.
The soldiers who captured Wynand were astounded when they realized who he was.
Toe het hulle nou die aard van die saak het een van hulle seniors daar aangekom, die ouens gestop want hulle wil my keel afsny en al sulke goed te doen. En toe het hulle my nou vasgebind en natuurlik aanvanklik nou vermoed dat ons is UNITA soldate. En eers toe hulle nou my hemp oopkry en sien ek is 'n blanke persoon, het hulle begin vra wat, toe sê ek nee wel, ek is 'n Suid-Afrikaner.
The capture of a South African in northern Angola made headlines around the world. South Africa had not only been caught out in a flagrant breach of the Lusaka Agreement, but it also cast a shadow over the relationship with America.
The American ambassador Nicol eventually sent a cable to Washington which summed up very well the relationship between South Africa and the United States, in which he said constructive engagement for the South Africans is a one-way street. They were not interested in any agreement with Angola that would leave an MPLA government in Luanda. What they wanted was to bring Savimbi to power.
The division in the South African cabinet was once again highlighted by the Cabinda attack.
And what it indicates is that there were two foreign policies in South Africa. There was the policy of the DFA, which was more moderate. I believe that Pik Botha was seriously engaged in negotiations with the Angolan government and the United States in 1984-1985, though it was a very uncompromising position, but he was engaged in negotiations. And then there was the policy of the military establishment.
Ek dink dit was die 2 standpunte van die 2 departemente. Die weermag het dreigemente gekry en het gesien hoe die land deur sekere basisse en aksies bedreig word. Dan stel hy 'n doel voor, dit moet gestop word. Dan sê hy wat het hy nodig om dit te stop. Dan tree hy op en dan kom hy aan, ek het aan my doel geslaag. Buitelandse sake se kultuur was anders. Hy het gesê hier is die probleem. Die probleem is die VVO, hulle gaan ons opdonder. Sanksies gaan neerword. Ons ekonomie gaan knak. En uiteindelik as jou ekonomie knak, het jy ook nie die militêre vermoë om staande te bly nie.
Pik Botha made the release of BushWarV2D2E2 his personal mission.
Dit is my obsessie geword om hierdie man terug te kry.
It would take 2 years to get BushWarV2D2E2 back on home soil. 2 years which turned into a lonely nightmare for him. In jail in Luanda, he passed the endless hours by scratching messages into the walls of his cell.
Ek moes aanvaar dat dit nie 'n vinnige proses gaan wees nie. Dit gaan nie nou binne 3 of 4 maande of 'n jaar uitgesorteer wees nie. Dit gaan 'n lang proses wees. So in die eerste plek moet jy aanvaar. Dit vat 8 maande, 6 na 8 maande toe om te aanvaar. En dan baie belangrik moet jy jouself in 'n roetine kry. Jy kan net sowel die hele dag op jou bed lê. Jy hoef nie op te staan nie. Jy kan mos maar nou doen wat jy wil. Maar dis belangrik vir jou eie verstand om in 'n roetine te kom. So jy staan elke oggend dieselfde tyd op, jy gaan slaap elke aand dieselfde tyd. Jy bepaal daai tyd. Niemand anders nie. Nou is goed. So jy staan op, dan doen jy oefeninge, dan gaan stort jy as daar 'n stortfasiliteit op daai stadium dan is en so werk jy jou hele dag letterlik uit vir jou roetine. Ek het byvoorbeeld elke aand as ek nou kos kry, dan kry ek 10 sigarette daarmee saam. En daai 10, nou moes ek beplan. So laat rook ek die eerste ene, en so laat die volgende ene, so laat per horlosie het ek gerook vir die dag. My laaste een kon 9:30 in die aand wees, dan sit nou op.
While Du kept himself going with regimented discipline, there were other soldiers in the African bush who were also caught up in a battle thousands of miles from their small island. Cuban soldiers wrote poems to deal with the pain and loneliness of war.
I still see the look of amazement in your eyes fixed in my memory. Suddenly you departed from me lying in my arms. I did not have enough blood to close your wound. They killed you in an instant at noon. Death was your dead body on the ground with no heartbeat, the sun burning your blood on the ground. But if only you were just passing by, if only a moment ago I had lent you my loader. Take the AK, get up you bastard, you are still young.
Wynand Du wrote,
Pain deep and constant, sorrow always here, haunting me with the lonesome thoughts. Why, God, did you leave me so? Wife and son so far away, independent, gone from me. Would they ever needing me? Why, God, allowing this?
and this comes from another Cuban soldier.
At this moment, while becoming one with the ground, I expect the firing of the enemy's howitzer. At this moment, while Sheto passes here at my side with his collapsible AK beneath his arms, running and firing while death bursts the rocks 2 meters away, at this moment, at this exact moment, my children are waking up in Santiago.
The first Cubans arrived in Angola in 1975. Over the next 10 years, there were constantly around 20,000 of them in the country. In the late 80s, that number rose to around 50,000. In the context of the Cold War, it was often alleged that the Cubans were in southern Africa as representatives of the Soviet Union. Pero Iglesias believes that in reality, this enormous effort was driven by the vision of one man.
Fidel Castro was arguably the greatest revolutionary then in power. What was the situation from the Cuban perspective, the way the Cubans saw it correctly in late 1975? It was not even a struggle between the FNLA and UNITA on one side and the MPLA on the other side. With the South African invasion, the nature of the struggle had changed, it became more defined, if you want, and it was really a struggle against apartheid.
In the War of Independence in Angola, Agostinho Neto of the MPLA made contact with Cuba, asked for assistance, and received it.
But the die was cast when the Cubans and the MPLA were talking about how they would support each other and help each other. I mean, basically, the MPLA regime was installed by the Cubans. There's no other way to look at it.
They were there to support the Angolan government to secure the territorial integrity of Angola.
The Soviet Union was involved. They sent advisors to Angola from 1975, as well as arms to a total value of as much as $6 billion.
From 75, after the independence, about 5-6 days after the independence, the first Soviet military instructors arrived there, followed by some what we call advisors, whose duties are a bit broader than just instructors, you see. And they stayed there. All in all, the number was over 10,000 people.
The Soviet Union and Cuba were allies.
Historically, we were together from the first days after the Cuban Revolution. You remember, from 60, 61, 62, this and that. But I think now everybody understood that the Cubans never been Soviet proxies, and Soviets never sent Cubans to Angola.
One question remains. How did the MPLA government in Angola pay for the war?
The Cuban involvement was the least expensive thing for the MPLA. Until September 1978, Cuba paid for all its expenses in Angola. In this agreement of September 1978, Angola pledged to pay for the upkeep of the Cuban troops in Angola, not the salary, but the food, the supplies, clothing, etc., shoes, boots, etc., etc. And also for the cost of transportation of the Cuban troops from Cuba to Havana and back. You are asking about the oil money. Well, look, the oil money went to the Angolan budget. And then from their budget, they paid whatever they paid to Cuba.
In the field, the influence of the Cubans was apparent.
Die dryfkrag agter Fabula was uit die aard van die saak die Kubane. Wat baie ouens sal vir jou sê, hulle was ook nie goed opgelei nie, maar ek sê vir jou, daar is eintlik niks skort met hulle nie. Ek het, na die oorlogsjare was ek op van hulle skietbane en die tegnologie wat daar toegepas was, bestaan nie in Suid-Afrika nie.
Cubans and South Africans sometimes unexpectedly found that they could relate to each other.
Straks, ons het met die Kubane nog 'n goeie verhouding gehad. Uniform sny deur politiek. Maar dieselfde probleme as ons gehad. Lang weg van die huis af, verlang huis toe ensovoorts en kos en ek dink hulle het maar dieselfde probleem gehad om die MPLA so opgelei te kry soos wat ons gesukkel het om die ander mense op te lei, want dis nie maklik om in so 'n kort tyd mense wat 'n guerrilla oorlogvoering goed ken op te lei om meer as guerrilla oorlogvoering te kan doen.
The Cubans were also supportive of SWAPO.
They were at the invitation of the Angolan government. It's a bilateral arrangement. But because they were friends, fine. Just same way South Africans were invited by UNITA to come to Angola.
Cooperation between South Africa and UNITA was top secret at the time. In the same year that Wynand de Tooy was captured, 1985, South Africa acknowledged the alliance for the first time.
Namibië was steeds die belangrikste element in al ons oorwegings. Maar wat ons gehelp het om stabiliteit en vrede wat ons gehandhaaf het, baie goed in Namibië moontlik te maak was of makliker te maak was die feit dat ons 'n vernoot gehad het in Savimbi, die leier van UNITA, want hy en sy organisasie het in die suide van Angola opgetree. En dit het dit vir SWAPO baie moeiliker gemaak om daar te opereer en vir ons makliker gemaak wanneer dit nodig was om daar te opereer. Daarom was UNITA vir ons belangrik. 'n Mens kan nie sê dat daai bosoorlog in Angola het niks te maak gehad met Namibië nie. Dit is heeltemal, totaal verkeerd. Dit is een ding wat mens nie uit die oog moet verloor nie. Die tweede ding wat mens nie uit die oog moet verloor nie, is, jy kan maar sê, as jy wil, dat Savimbi was 'n puppet, en UNITA was 'n puppet organisasie, as dit jou pas. Maar, hy het nie vir hom laat voorskryf nie. Hy het eendag by geleentheid gesê, hy het seker van alle vryheidsbewegings in die wêreld die beste vernoot in Suid-Afrika, want hulle skryf nie vir hom voor nie.
South Africa and UNITA went into battle together ever since 1975. In the early days, both parties relied on American support. That was withdrawn very suddenly in December 75 when the Senate and Congress cut all funding with the passing of the Clark Amendment. In July 1985, only 2 short months after de Tooy's capture and in spite of international censure of the Cabinda attack, the USA made an about-turn and recalled the Clark Amendment. The path was cleared for American support to Savimbi and UNITA, which would run into millions of dollars over the following years.
US aid to Savimbi after the 75-76 fiasco didn't really begin probably in 86, began already with the Carter administration. What you have in 86 is an increase in the a dramatic increase in the amount, the significance of USA to Savimbi because it became open. And this US aid to Savimbi was important in terms of monetary value, was a fraction of what South Africa was giving, but they provided some weapons that South Africa could not provide, like the Stinger against planes, some anti-tank weapons that South Africa could not provide.
In August 1985, UNITA needed all the help it could get. Intelligence indicated a very dangerous FAPLA offensive. They wanted to capture Mavinga, an important logistical and strategic UNITA base in southeastern Angola, where South Africa was also well entrenched, with a large Air Force base and permanent personnel. FAPLA launched Operation Second Congress, a pincer movement by two forces aimed at capturing Mavinga. With the airport at Mavinga under their control, Jamba, UNITA's headquarters in southeastern Angola, would be within their reach. With the aid of South Africa, and especially the Air Force, this offensive was stopped by the end of September 85. But FAPLA won control of the town of Quito. 2 years later, they would start from there and again try to cross the Lomba River. That would lead to what the history books call the Battle of Quito Carnival.
Hierdie keer kom dan nou die offensief van alle offensiewe. The mother of all offensives.
While the whole of southeastern Angola was caught up in military movement and planning, one day was like the next for Wynand de Tooy in jail in Luanda. Next week on Bush War, the pressure mounts inside and outside the country.
But when troops went into the townships, who was in the townships? The people we saw in the streets around us and our servants. We knew them personally, we knew them intimately. They changed our nappies and cooked our food. And these are the people we were going to be pointing our guns at.
Ons glo, dit is die basis waarop ons gewerk het, dat hulle word misbruik deur die kommuniste. Hulle word ingespan om die kommunistiese doelwit te verwesenlik in Suid-Afrika. Maar dit het onmeetbaar moeiliker geword vir ons met die politiek en ook vir die troepies self om binnelands op te tree. Want dit is mede Suid-Afrikaners.
In Angola, tension was also building.
Dit was 'n aanslag, 'n aanmars, 'n offensief van Angolese FAPLA magte met Russiese raadgewers en so meer, 'n Russiese krygstuig op Jamba, wat in die verre suidooste van Angola was. Jamba was die hart en siel van UNITA geweest. Dit was Savimbi se kultuursentrum. Sy regering was daar gesetel.